Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now I've had a lot of people requesting that I do this one, which is addressing a recent podcast from Danny Jones where our old friend Bart debated, or rather interrogated, Apollo 16 astronaut Charlie Duke. The entire podcast was about 4 hours long. The opening 40 minutes was Charlie talking about his training, the Apollo 16 mission, and so on. And then we get to Bart coming in and basically spending more than 3 hours accusing Charlie of being a liar.
There's crazy people out there. There's lots of crazy lunatics out there who will say anything and make up stories. And the same thing is true that
and one of them is sitting across from me.
Well, I don't think so. I don't necessarily think that. I think that
saying they never went to the moon and scattergunning through the same rehearsed script that he puts out on every podcast without really giving Charlie much of a chance to respond to any of his points.
And I am not lying. I landed on the moon. And the evidence is overwhelming.
Well, actually, the opposite is true. People can say anything. The evidence is not overwhelming.
People can say anything. The evidence is not overwhelming. Just pin that statement in your mind throughout this video. A lot of these claims that Bart's making are ones I've already debunked in videos in the past. So I'm going to run through the claims that Bart makes, highlighting why they were either completely false or merely speculation, and highlighting a few amusing moments where Bart manages to contradict himself. But just remember what Bart says there. People can say anything, the evidence is not overwhelming. Because by the end of this, it should be pretty clear, Bart's going from podcast to podcast saying these same things without actually having any evidence to support the claims. Just a quick side note before we start, though. Some people will be questioning what this watermark is that appears throughout the video. There's people who keep stealing my content and posting it onto TikTok, pretending to be me, and no amount of reporting to TikTok seemingly does anything. So the only solution that I can come up with is to make my own TikTok channel and watermark all my videos, so that when people then steal the videos, they're at least advertising me. Well, just in case you're wondering. So, anyway, to begin with, Danny asks Bart for what his best evidence is.
Like, to you, what are like the top two or three reasons that you believe that the moon landing was a hoax?
The first, we have an eyewitness who saw them film Apollo 11 at Cannon Air Force Base. He confessed to it as he was dying. This gentleman's name is Cyrus Eugene Akers. He was the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base. We can have a video of the son and put it in his own words.
President Johnson in 1968, okay? In Cannon Air Force Base in 1968, he said by the time he got there, that there was already 2 large hangars that were connected.
This is not a deathbed confession of an eyewitness. The claimed eyewitness was his father, but there's no evidence of that actual confession because it was apparently destroyed in a fire. So, we have a deathbed video of somebody claiming to have witnessed a deathbed confession. The argument goes that Cyrus Eugene Akers was head of security at Cannon Air Force Base, and he witnessed the moon landings being faked on June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1968, with President Johnson on site to watch the whole thing, and then made a deathbed confession about it before his death in 2002. And his son, Gene Gilmore, then made a video explaining all of this prior to his death in 2022. Now, I've highlighted before, Gene's reasoning for making that video when he did doesn't make sense. Firstly, if you're given a deathbed confession from an eyewitness that says one of the greatest achievements in human history is a lie, you don't bother making any backups? Secondly, he says the reason for it not being public was to protect his family.
Dad told me all these things father to son. He also told me not to ever tell anyone what he had said, but he said on his deathbed that he had to tell somebody before he died because it was just too important not to tell. I sure as hell wasn't going to tell anybody.
Well, this just doesn't make any sense. Sees this earth-shattering thing happen, but doesn't tell anybody. But then on his deathbed decides it's too important not to tell, so tells his son, but doesn't want his son to then tell anybody else, even though it's this important. And I don't know about you, if I was telling a secret to somebody and I didn't want them to then tell everybody else, the last thing I would do is film myself saying it. And then Gene, having been told not to tell anybody, says he's not going to tell anybody until 20 years later when he then decides to make a video that he's going to send to Bart Sibrel, who's going to use it to tell everybody. However, this webpage on onegreatmonkey.com is fantastic. I'll link it down below. It highlights many other problems with Bart's and Gene's claims. For example, Bart says there's no record of Gene's military history, as though a lying, corrupt government is trying to hide and erase all trace of him.
In fact, the gentleman's Air Force file has been completely deleted. We used a Freedom of Information Act request. They said there's no Cyrus Eugene Akers. There's never was in the Air Force, and yet...
Except there's many of his service record details around. Gene says his father was head of security at Cannon Air Force Base, but the records show that Cyrus Akers was a staff sergeant, whilst the actual head of security at Cannon Air Force Base was a Captain Edward L. Schafferman. And he says that Lyndon B. Johnson was there from June 1st to June 3rd, 1968 to witness all the faking of the moon landings.
Okay, President Johnson only showed up for the first day of filming. Filming lasted for 3 days, and the entire project was restored to original.
Except at the start of June 1968, President Johnson was on his ranch in Texas with actor Gregory Peck. There's video footage of them there, and even records in Johnson's diary for those 3 days saying he was in Texas for the whole time, meeting various different people, some 400 miles away from Cannon Air Force Base. So, in answer to Bart's later question...
So either the gentleman we saw is lying or you're lying. One of the two.
So far, the evidence is pointing to his eyewitness being the liar. Bart's next apparent evidence, though, had me in stitches.
If I climbed Mount Everest and was known for climbing Mount Everest, and somebody came along and started saying, you didn't do it. It was filmed in a TV studio. I certainly wouldn't fly and make an airport change and stay overnight in a hotel and go to podcast to defend that I'd climbed Mount Everest. I wouldn't waste my time. So why are you here?
Me?
Yeah.
Why are you here? The fact that Charlie went there to talk about going to the moon somehow means he didn't go to the moon? Why don't we have it then that the fact that Bart's flying around the world, going from podcast to talk about the moon landings being faked, must therefore mean he's lying and they actually happened? Unfortunately, this is a classic, complete lack of logic when it comes to conspiracy theorists. If people show up to challenge the claims that are being made, it's proof they're trying to hide something. But if they don't show up, then the same conspiracy theorists will say that it's proof that they're guilty because they know they can't defend it. I know because I've faced exactly the same backwards logic personally. In December 2024, I went to Antarctica and filmed the 24-hour sun. Flat Earthers really did not like that, and to this day, many of them claim the whole trip was fake, that we did it in a studio, just like moon landing deniers do. And I've not only had flat earthers claim that we must be hiding something because I've not debated XYZ about it, but when I've then been in debates with other flat earthers about it, I see people saying the only reason I'm there defending the trip is because I know it's a lie. It's the conspiracy classic that there's no right answer for them. It's heads they win, tails you lose. There's no logic to a lot of their arguments. As you'll see from Bart throughout this entire video, many of his claims either fail with logic or fail with basic physics. You know, Bart would probably benefit from doing some of the courses on Brilliant.org. They have a whole section on how to improve your logic and critical thinking. numerous courses on various aspects of physics, and much more. It is a fantastic online learning tool that's made all the more effective by their use of interactive animations that I find makes the content much more engaging. So engaging, in fact, I've been using Brilliant for several years, and currently I have a daily streak of 990 days of completing classes. At this rate, I will hit the big 1,000 days before Christmas. But don't just take my word for it. See how much Brilliant can expand your knowledge and thinking for free by visiting my link brilliant.org/Dave McKeegan or scanning the QR code on screen. And doing so will entitle you to 20% off their annual subscription. Right, back to this ambush, which now sees Bart go on to quiz Charlie about his security clearance.
You retired a general, right? Okay. What was your security clearance?
Top secret.
Okay. So when you have a top secret, you're not allowed to tell your wife or your children, right?
What?
Whatever the secrets are.
Bart takes his answer and just runs with it, arguing Charlie would therefore lie to his own family about government secrets and thus he can't be trusted.
Now, if you're willing to lie to your wife and to your children, why should we believe you?
Except, as Charlie later points out,
We had nothing in Apollo that was classified. I did have a clearance from my military time when I was before NASA, and I did have a top secret clearance then.
the criteria for NASA astronauts then was either you're an Air Force pilot or you have to have 1,000 hours of flying experience. Hence, most of the astronauts were military test pilots, including Charlie Duke, who a year before he enrolled into NASA joined the Aerospace Research Pilot School. So he had top secret clearance related to all of that stuff. But just having top secret clearance does not then permit you access to classified information for the entire country. So far, Bart's first 3 chosen pieces of evidence for the moon landings being faked are a claimed eyewitness, whose information is all demonstrably false, the fact that Charlie Duke showed up to talk about walking on the moon, and pure speculation based on having top secret clearance to a completely different branch of the government. Not really a compelling start. Let's hope his next points are a bit more relevant.
Who do you think killed JFK?
Well, that would be a no then. So now one conspiracy is proof of a completely different, unrelated conspiracy. Whatever next. Aliens might be real, therefore Elvis is still alive. Anyway, Charlie at this point starts to counter Bart's claims with the pretty common arguments that some 400,000 people worked on Apollo.
To you, but I'm saying...
No, wait a minute. In the United States, there were 400,000 people working on Apollo.
Right.
Well, I mean,
Bart counters this by saying that not all of them would need to know it was fake.
there are 400,000 tellers at Bank of America. But do you really think what the teller knows and what the CEO knows about corruption in the bank are identical? Do we really think the CIA is so stupid to tell the guy making the glove or the door or the boot, hey, we're really not going to the moon, be sure not to tell anybody?
Bart then goes on to reference Gene Kranz, apparently saying that from inside the control center, there's no difference between a simulation and a real flight.
I interviewed Eugene Krantz. He told me that someone in the command center at the console can tell no difference whatsoever between a simulation and an actual flight.
Now, of course, simulations are supposed to closely mimic real events. The whole point is to train for the events, so making it as lifelike as possible makes it more effective.
Once the rocket went up, there's only 3 eyewitnesses to the mission and no independent press coverage. So if someone in the command center cannot tell the difference between a real flight and a simulated flight, how can the public watching it from their living room or people years later? So that argument is flat.
However, Bart's idea that only a handful of people would need to know it was fake has some huge problems to it. According to Bart, as we'll get onto later, he accepts the astronauts went into space, but he says that they stayed in low Earth orbit rather than travelling to the moon. Well, for starters, there was tracking stations all around the world that were tracking the spacecrafts to the moon and back. listening into radio conversations and picking up the TV feed. If they were in low Earth orbit, they'd be orbiting once every 90 minutes. So tracking stations would be repeatedly losing and reacquiring signals, versus when they're thousands of miles away, they would stay with an individual tracking station for a long period of time. So all the people in the various tracking stations would have to know it was a lie. There were amateur radio operators that were able to pick up the radio transmissions, but only when they pointed their antennas towards the moon. There were astronomers who used their telescopes to photograph the translunar injection burns that sent the astronauts to the moon. So if NASA weren't sending astronauts there, but they were up in a rocket somewhere else, that would mean they would have to be launching other rockets at the same time and sending those to the moon with the radio transmissions. Well, there's zero record of any of that happening, but all of the people involved in those rocket launches would have known what they were doing. Not to mention all the people at Cannon Air Force Base, the people who built all the sets they supposedly used there, whatever film crew came out to record the whole thing. You had the ground crew at the Cape that prepared the rocket and loaded the crew in. Well, if they didn't know about it, it must have been damn suspicious why they were loading crates of moon rocks in before the launch, given that when the USS Hornet picked up the command module 3 days later, not only were the 3 astronauts on board, but there was a load of moon rocks. Though Charlie does bring up the existence of the moon rocks, which Bart counters with 2 claims. Firstly, he claims that the moon rocks are only a match to the lunar rocks because they're lunar meteorites that Werner von Braun had collected from Antarctica.
Giving some of it out. I haven't been with NASA in a long, long time, so I don't know how it works today.
So Bart, how do you explain us having actual moon rocks here on Earth?
Well, like I said, von Braun went to Antarctica. There's a picture of him in Antarctica where he collected hundreds of pounds of lunar meteorites, which they used for fake moon rocks.
Now, von Braun did go to Antarctica in early 1967 with some astronauts to study human survival in harsh environments. The problem with Bart's meteorites claim, though, is the first lunar meteorites were in fact found in Antarctica, but the first one that was found was called Allen Hills 81005. But that wasn't found until 1982. 13 years after the first moon landings and 5 years after von Braun had died. Then Bart also claims the old classic of the Petrified Wood.
That Neil Armstrong, chain of custody, allegedly picked up a rock, personally put it in his pocket, and then later personally gave it to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, which was immediately sealed in a container in a museum, was opened up a few years ago, and it's petrified wood. It's a fake. The moon rocks are fake.
This one gets brought up by a lot of people. In fact, Bart brings this one up on a lot of podcasts and always gives the same story.
You have Neil Armstrong said he personally picked up a particular rock, put it in his pocket, and saved it for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
who he gave to, right?
He says, Armstrong takes a lump of moon rock on the moon, puts it in his pocket, later hands it to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who immediately puts it in a box in a museum where it remained until they tested it, and they found it was petrified wood. And when he's brought it up in other podcasts, like for example on Joe Rogan's, Joe asked him about the chain of custody. Was there any gaps in the chain of custody where things could have got mixed up or swapped around?
You would say, what was the chain of custody between Neil Armstrong and this Prime Minister?
He brought it to him. He personally gave it to him. And he said, I picked this up off the surface of the moon. This is the rock. Right. I remember it. Here you go. They put it in a box. That's not much chain of command to get messed up.
And Bart was adamant, no. It was from Armstrong's possession, straight to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, straight into a museum, and then that was it. Well, that's Bart's version of events, but there are several glaring holes in that argument. The entire TV broadcast of the moonwalk is online. Nowhere can Armstrong be seen picking up a moon rock and putting it in his suit pocket. But even if he did, when they got back to Earth, they were picked up by an aircraft carrier who put them into isolation for 3 weeks, while the command module, all the rock samples, and their flight suits were transported separately to the Lunar Receiving Lab. They didn't leave there until the middle of August, at which point the astronauts toured America, before then touring the world, which is when they then visited the Netherlands. So there's plenty of holes in that chain of custody. But even more glaring, the petrified wood that was given to the museum was from William de Ries. He was not the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He was a former Prime Minister who'd left office 11 years before the moon landings. And the record for the museum says it was given to him by the US Ambassador J. William Middendorf, not Neil Armstrong. The US presented moon rock samples to many countries around the world, including the Netherlands, but none were just a lump of moon rock handed out. They were small offcuts of moon rock that were presented on formal plaques. And the wood didn't just go straight from de Ries's possession into a sealed box into a museum. The museum did not get hold of it until after 1988 when de Ries passed away. All his possessions were gathered up and some of it was given to the museum. The museum say they vetted this moon rock by phoning NASA 20 years after the moon landings and asking, could this be a piece of moon rock? So museums handed this thing in amongst a bunch of possessions, thought it might be a moon rock, phoned NASA and asked, could it be? NASA, having not seen this thing, say, it could well be because we gave out moon rock samples, so the museum take that as a yes it is. This is merely a story of a piece of petrified wood getting mistaken for a moon rock, having been passed from pillar to post for more than 2 decades. But obviously, that's not a very compelling narrative for Bart, so instead he cuts out huge gaps in the timeline and twists the events to make it sound more plausible.
People can say anything. The evidence is not overwhelming.
Then, Charlie brings up another typical counter-argument, which is the Soviets never called NASA out. To which Bart says that China and Russia know it was faked and they're blackmailing NASA.
It doesn't go anywhere. And neither does the argument that the Russians would have spilled the beans. Because I know somebody who works in the command center of the Chinese Space Agency. He said everybody there knows that the moon missions are fake and they're blackmailing NASA because Congress passed a law forbidding space technology to be sold to China, and they're receiving it anyway by blackmail.
Again, Bart provides absolutely zero evidence to support this claim.
People can say anything. The evidence is not overwhelming.
He says he knows somebody in the Chinese Space Agency, but doesn't say who, doesn't say how they know it was faked, says them and Russia are blackmailing NASA for technology, but doesn't say what. And that, for me, is where this claim does not make sense. China didn't even have a space agency until 1993. At that point, there were already 28 other countries with space agencies, so surely they would have all known the moon landings were fake as well. Bearing in mind, before 1991, there wasn't a Russian space agency, it was the Soviet Union. Following the disbanding, many of the devolved countries then got separate space agencies. They would have all known about it beforehand, but none of them are bribing NASA. But here's the question that shows why none of this makes sense. Bribing NASA for what? Because barely 3 minutes after Bart claims that the Soviets are bribing NASA, he makes the point that prior to going to the moon, the Soviets were ahead of the Americans.
The Soviets launched the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecrafts altogether. They spent 5 time man-hours in space, and they never went to the moon.
Yes, in the space race, the Soviets were ahead of the Americans for doing things in low Earth orbit, which is precisely why NASA set their target as the moon. Kennedy needed a goal in space that the US could realistically beat the Soviets at. But the problem was they were starting from so far behind, there was realistically nothing they could do in low Earth orbit that they could do first. Because as soon as the Soviets got wind of any of it, like developing a space station, the Soviets were far enough ahead that they could start their own and still get there first. The whole point of picking the moon is because it would essentially force both sides to start with a clean slate. Now, the only reason NASA would have for faking the moon landings is if they didn't have the technology to be able to do it, but they wanted the world to believe they'd beaten the Soviets. But Bart is saying that the Soviet Space Agency, rather than outing the Americans, are bribing technology out of them. But he's just argued that at that time, the Soviets had better technology. So why would the Soviets bribe the Americans for inferior tech? The only reason they would be bribing tech from another country is if that tech was superior. But if the Americans had better tech than the Soviets, then Bart's argument goes flying out the window. And the Soviets clearly thought that going to the moon was possible because not only were they developing their own heavy-lift rocket, the N-1, they were sending craft like the Zond 5 in 1968 around the moon with living things on board to see how well they would hold up in space. And after that, they were also developing the LK lunar lander, which they test flew 3 times in 1970 and 1971, after Apollo landed on the moon. Why would they be developing their own lunar lander if they couldn't land on the moon? Bart then brings up some more of his typical claims, like saying Gus Grissom's wife Betty had said in an interview that Gus told her the day before the Apollo 1 fire, the CIA were all over the launch pad.
Now, I also interviewed Betty Grissom.
Yeah.
And according to his son and widow, he was murdered by the CIA. She told me that on January 26, 1967, he telephoned her from NASA and said, "Hon, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad today. I've never seen them here before. For some reason, they showed up today."
Did you ever see the CIA?
The very next day, he's dead by a, quote, accident.
Again, absolutely no evidence to support this one. No recording of any interview where Betty says this.
People can say anything. The evidence is not overwhelming.
Though, one small positive note I can give Bart here is for years, whenever he's brought this claim up, he's always asserted that Betty said Gus came home from work the day before.
His wife told me that on January 26, 1967, he came home from work and said the following. On January 26, 1967, he came home and told his wife the following, who told me. She said on January 26, 1967, he came home from work and said this. His widow told me that on January 26, 1967, he came home from work and said. Wife told me this, Matt. On January 26, 1967, he came home from work and said the following. Betty told me on January 26, 1967, came home from work at NASA and said, "Hon, the man who would have been the first crew to walk on the moon came home the day before he died and said, 'Hon, there's some strange things going on.'" She said, "What?"
Except, as I highlighted in a previous video that I did, specifically about the whole Gus Grissom conspiracy, Betty says she last saw Gus a few days before the fire, not the day before. Bart has now at least changed his script to say that Gus called Betty rather than went home. But even then, the whole notion of the CIA being the cause of the Apollo 1 fire is completely backwards. Bart's logic is the Apollo program was so far behind and Gus was being very vocal against it that the CIA wanted to silence him. Except he died when the Apollo 1 command module caught fire during a test that also killed 2 other astronauts who'd had nothing bad to say about the program. The fire resulted in the suspension of the Apollo program whilst they investigated it and then made many changes to the design, which caused even more delays. Yet, as Walter Cunningham highlights, who was on the Apollo 1 backup crew, he said in an interview, immediately after that test that went wrong, all 6 astronauts were due to fly individually in jet planes from Florida to Houston.
Wally Don and I, all of us were going to come back to Houston at night from the Cape. And Wally Don and I decided that we'd wait. We had some other things we could do, and we'd wait so we could go back with the prime crew at the same time. So we would end up with 6 airplanes flying back.
So why would the CIA rig the rocket to kill him along with 2 other innocent people and cause a load more delays rather than rig a plane which would get Grissom out of the way but nowhere near the rocket or the program? Listening to Bart on podcasts, he seems to just blame everything on the CIA, making out like they were trying to silence anybody who threatened to talk about the moon landings being faked.
So the dead astronaut's son says the CIA is involved, and he got whistleblower protection up until the day that he died. The CIA is threatening to kill me, right? And why would this source of mine, who was also threatened by the CIA, he received whistleblower protection by the FBI?
Though somebody is going to need to explain that logic for me. If the moon landings were faked, the US government would have known about it, NASA would have known about it, and according to him, the CIA not only knew about it, but were actively trying to kill everybody to stop them talking about it. But then he says the FBI, another US government agency, are apparently trying to protect all these people from the CIA. Doesn't make sense. Neither does his story that the CIA apparently tried to kill him to stop him talking. Except he clearly didn't do a very good job because he spent the last 20 years going on podcasts to tell everybody. And he immediately highlights his own contradictions again, because after talking about Gus Grissom and the CIA, he then references that several other astronauts died during the Apollo program.
There are other deaths. There are a total of 15% of the Apollo astronauts died in accidents within a 2-year period. These are the astronauts who would not cooperate with the fraud. Go ahead, play the clip.
Grissom, White, and Chaffee all died in the Apollo 1 fire, but Elliot C., Charlie Bassett, Clifton Williams, and Theodore Freeman all died in crashes involving the T-38 training jets that the astronauts used to fly back and forth between Florida and Houston. But Bart's portraying that all these astronauts were intentionally killed to stop them speaking out about the Apollo program, even though most of them weren't actually involved in the Apollo program because they died during the Gemini program. But Bart even plays a video clip of Bill Casing to try and reinforce this.
These deaths accounted for an astonishing 15% of NASA's astronaut corps.
To keep something that's alive wrapped up and covered over, you've got to eliminate all the people that can talk about it.
Bill Casing is basically the father of the moon landing conspiracy. Bart actually references Bill's time at Rocketdyne quite a lot in other podcasts.
And then I'm 14 years old, and I see Bill Casing, a former Rocketdyne employee who worked for NASA for 6 years on the Apollo program with high security clearance, only second to von Braun, who says, look, I edited a memo from von Braun to the Pentagon warning them they are not going to make the goal.
Strangely, though, Bart never plays the clip of Bill Casing saying that he got the idea to say the moon landings were fake in 1974 from a heroin-addicted Vietnam War veteran because he didn't like the US government. Hi, sorry, I just need to interject here because there's been some interesting developments in the past couple of days since I originally recorded the video. At this point, I was going to play the video that I've got of Bill Casing saying what Bill Casing says. However, that video originally came from a channel called Deadpool 69 Special. And I went onto his channel whilst I was editing just to get a little screenshot of the video title and the details, and the video's no longer there. So I messaged Deadpool and asked if he'd deleted the video, and he responded saying he'd not. Instead, it's now been reported for copyright by Bart Sibrel. So I'm not going to play the clip, just in case they try and remove this video as well, but the video is available elsewhere if you want to go and find it. Deadpool has sent me a screenshot of the copyright takedown claim to show that it has actually been removed because of Bart Sibrel's copyright. And I have also found a website article from several years ago that actually quotes what Bill says in that clip. But then Bart moves on to the age-old arguments of technology.
And the main reason for many people is that today, with 5 decades better rockets and technology, the farthest that NASA can send an astronaut into space is 1,000th the distance to the moon. So what they're claiming is, for the first time in the history of the world, technology was greater in the past than in the future.
Now, there are examples of technology going backwards. Wootz steel, for example, is an ancient method of making crucible steel. Nowadays, the closest we can get to replicating it is Damascus steel, which, even with all the modern knowledge and technology, is actually considered inferior. Obviously, that is an extreme example with centuries in between. It's not a true direct comparison with the situation for Apollo, but it just shows there are examples of this sort of thing happening. There are others that people told me about with stuff from World War II, but I can't remember exactly what off the top of my head. But then, the clip that Bart references isn't saying they can't replicate it.
Listen to NASA saying they destroyed the technology.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
So, General, why was that technology destroyed?
It's Don Pettit saying the technology was destroyed. In this case, he's talking about the Saturn V and all the production lines that the various contractors had to build the many components. And building all of that back up would take time. The analogy that I often use for this is go and try calling up Ford and ask them to build you an original spec Model T. They couldn't just do it because the numerous components within that car are all things that are no longer made. Now, Danny actually brings up a good example to counter Bart here, which is one I've previously used as well.
How is it? I mean, is there any machine, technological machine you can think of, cell phone,
supersonic jets,
microwave, anything that worked better in 1969 than its counterpart today?
What about supersonic jets?
And once again, Bart ends up trumping his own argument.
Well, they decided that people aren't going to pay 20 times more to get there twice as fast.
Exactly.
Right?
That's my point.
Right. Well, that they could use it, but they're just not.
Correct.
Right. So
Concorde is a great example where, very similar to NASA, the costs were unsustainable, so the program was scrapped in favor of more cost-effective options. In the case of Apollo, it was scrapped to make way for the space shuttle in an attempt to make spaceflight cheaper and more reusable. There is now work being done on a replacement to Concorde with Boom Supersonic, just like SLS is being worked on to replace what the Saturn V did. But in both instances, they're not trying to directly copy old hardware designs. They're trying to improve on the shortfalls to make the whole program more economically viable. Bart argues it's not the same thing because they still use supersonic jets.
Supersonic jets.
what about them? The sound barrier is broken 200 times a day all around the world in military aircraft.
We stopped using them because they were ineffective and they weren't cost effective. They were inefficient and they were way more
airplanes are breaking the sound barrier at a rate of 200 a day.
But the jets in question are small 1 or 2 man jets, not large ones capable of carrying dozens of people. Well, NASA still have rockets that can fly to the moon. They launched the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter nearly 20 years ago. What they didn't have until SLS is something capable of carrying a large enough payload to support humans all the way to the moon. Just like how whilst we still have supersonic planes, we don't have ones capable of carrying a large enough payload to support a family of people. But the funniest part for me is that whilst they're talking about Don Pettit saying the technology was destroyed, Bart asks a very thought-provoking question.
Where the rocket really was. So back to the destroy.
1 second. Can I ask a question?
Well, either this guy is lying, right? Why would a NASA astronaut lie?
Why would a NASA astronaut lie? Asks the guy who has not only just spent the past hour sat across a table from a NASA astronaut accusing them of being a liar, but who has spent 2 decades accusing NASA astronauts of lying. And then Bart tries comparing Apollo to a B52 bomber.
you may know more specifically, but the B52 Bomber was designed 70 years ago. It's simple, it's reliable, the same words used about the Saturn V rocket. And there's still 200 of them in service today. So why would they spend a modern equivalent of $250 billion to make this rocket that flies to the moon on the very first attempt and then destroy it?
A complete apples to oranges comparison, because after each mission, a B-52 returns to base and just needs to refuel before it can fly again. NASA would spend millions building one Saturn V, launch it, the whole thing would be expended. When they wanted to then fly another one, they had to spend the money all over again to build a brand new one. Consider how long the B-52 would have remained in service if the Air Force had to buy a brand new one after each flight. Then he brings up two more technology arguments, which are just fantastically disingenuous. Firstly, about oxygen.
They destroyed it to cover their tracks, because I went scuba diving, and to have an hour's worth of air, it takes 2 tanks this big and that big around. That would be 16 tanks of air you would have to have on your back on the moon.
Now, I have done a video a long time ago dedicated to this argument, and honestly, I was very surprised Bart even tried pulling this one, because I've never heard him trying to claim it before. Honestly, I thought he was better than this, but comparing scuba tanks to Apollo is another complete apples to oranges comparison. Scuba tanks hold compressed air, which is only 21% oxygen, and they're being used underwater where the pressure is much higher, so the pressure of air being breathed in is higher than the 14 psi that we even typically have now. Apollo suits, by comparison, used 100% oxygen, not mixed air, so straight away that's 5 times more breathing per tank. And the suits were only pressurized to 5 psi, so that's at least 3 times more breathing capabilities on top. But the more important factor is, only a small amount of the oxygen that we breathe in actually gets absorbed. The rest of it gets exhaled. We actually breathe out about 3/4 of the oxygen that we breathe in. And when a scuba diver exhales, all that leftover oxygen is immediately lost into the surrounding water and floats off to the surface. Whereas in a completely sealed spacesuit, the oxygen just hangs around near the astronaut waiting to be breathed in later on. A fairer comparison would be high-altitude climbing rebreather systems rather than scuba. Those are enclosed loops, like a spacesuit, and they operate at lower pressure, like a spacesuit, and those things can provide oxygen for up to 10 hours. Longer than an Apollo EVA. The daft part is, though, Bart's arguing that Apollo EVAs wouldn't have had enough oxygen, but he's never argued against the ISS EVAs that go on for even longer. And then, the last technology argument he brings up is claiming that Wernher von Braun had said one rocket will never go to the moon without multiple refueling.
That's why they destroyed all the technology, because it could be proved later that the rocket didn't have enough fuel to leave Earth orbit, which we have proof of as well. I have von Braun's own quote, which we'll read, that says one rocket will never go to the moon without multiple fueling.
Again, I have a video dedicated to addressing this point. At the time that von Braun had wrote about needing multiple rockets, he was envisaging a giant, single craft flying 12 people straight to the moon's surface with enough supplies to stay there for a month. A significantly larger payload than a tiny 2-person lander with supplies for 2 days. A payload so large, in fact, that no rocket booster setup could be built that was large enough to lift that entire mass all the way to Earth orbit. Thus, there would need to be refueling involved. Just like SpaceX is going to require refueling to get the skyscraper-sized Starship that they want to send to the moon, because that thing needs to use most of its initial fuel supply just to reach orbit. Of course, the topic of radiation also gets brought up with the Van Allen belts, and Bart plays his favourite clip from Kelly Smith talking about Orion.
And here we have the young guy in his 20s saying that the belts are dangerous radiation and the technology to go through them has not been invented yet.
As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. We must solve these challenges before we send...
Again, I've covered this one before in videos, but context is key. Kelly Smith was specifically talking about Orion, and he was in charge of the navigation and computer systems.
My name is Kelly Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion.
And he was talking specifically about the navigation and computer systems.
Radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back.
Even though they were confident that the Orion craft would be fine going through the belts, they still have to test it before it can be rated for human flight. NASA did exactly the same thing with Apollos 4 and 6.
At the end of that period, however, we prepare the third stage of the Saturn V for its restart. That is, the burn which will simulate the burn we will eventually do to inject the spacecraft on the way to the moon. After that time, while we were coasting up to an apogee of about 10,000 nautical miles above the Earth, both vehicles again become relatively quiet.
And the Orion flight that Kelly was talking about was a very extreme case, because Orion going to the moon would fly very quickly through the belts and out the other side. For their test flight, however, they didn't have SLS. Only a Delta IV Heavy, which could get Orion into the belts but not through them, meaning Orion was left loitering in the belts for a much longer period of time, with modern silicon-based computer systems that are far more susceptible to radiation than the old hand-wired computers of Apollo. Bart then gets Danny to bring up an online article about space radiation.
Read this article, What's Keeping Us from Mars?
Cosmic rays are so dangerous and so poorly understood that people are unlikely to get to Mars or even back to the moon until better ways are found to protect astronauts, experts said on Monday.
Of course, he's happy for Danny to be reading the opening attention-grabbing part, which makes it sound like if an astronaut even tries going to the moon, they're going to get fried. But if you actually read down the article, it says, the younger you are, the worse it is, because as with these types of radiation, it can take years for the damage to cause disease. And then it says, any mission to Mars using current technology would take 3 years. That long in space would subject astronauts to too much radiation. So the article is talking about having astronauts in space for periods of months or even years. The moon missions that they're talking about now are talking about astronauts being on the moon for weeks or months at a time, not the 2 days that Apollo was there. But finally, let's wrap this up with my favourite claim of Bart's.
In order to shoot the Earth far away floating in space, he says, he's lying, 130,000 miles out, and he says that the camera is completely filling up the window. That's a lie too. The camera is really at the back of the spacecraft. There's about 15 feet between the camera and the window. There's Buzz Aldrin removing part of the effect in front of the window. That's a work light. The camera has been at the back of the spacecraft the entire time.
Bart has repeatedly stated that this is the thing that convinced him it was all fake.
This is what convinced me. I gave NASA the benefit of the doubt for as long as possible. And when I saw this, they are faking halfway to the moon.
He thinks they're faking being halfway to the moon and that instead they're just in low Earth orbit and they've placed a cutout in the window to make the Earth appear smaller, and then they've removed the cutout to make the cabin brighter. Again, I've done a video pulling this claim to pieces as well. There's so many problems with Bart's ideas. Firstly, if the cabin was getting brighter because they removed a cutout from the window, the interior light in the video would not also get brighter. If you set up a camera with fixed exposure settings in a room with the curtains closed and I have a light on, and then open the curtains, the room as a whole will get brighter, but the bulb won't. The light bulb will only get brighter if you change the exposure settings of the camera, which is exactly what happened. They originally had the camera close to the window to view the Earth, then Houston asked them to show the interior.
Unfortunately, we only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with a TV camera, so your view now is probably better than ours is. Roger, we copy. 11, Houston, if you could comply, we'd like to see some smiling faces up there. If you could give us some interior views, I'm sure everybody'd like to see you. Over. Okay, we'll reconfigure the TV for that. Roger.
So they move the camera back away from the window and they open up the iris of the lens to let in more light so that you can see the interior. Secondly, watch any footage from low Earth orbit. Being that close to Earth, travelling at over 17,000 miles an hour, the clouds move pretty quickly. Here's footage from Apollo 9's EVA in low Earth orbit, where you can see the Earth through a small circular window on the hatch. Very much like the scenario that Bart is claiming was done on Apollo 11. But the clouds are constantly changing. The broadcast of Apollo 11 watched the Earth uninterrupted for several minutes, with no changes to the clouds. And at the end of the broadcast, some 30 minutes later, they return to the same window to view the Earth again. And whilst the cloud patterns are generally unchanged, you can see the Earth has actually rotated slightly. Exactly the behaviour that we'd expect viewing the Earth from tens of thousands of miles away, not from hundreds of miles away. And in that previous video, I also showed another Apollo 11 TV broadcast where you can see them take the camera to view the Earth, but the window frame is clearly in view. No cutouts anywhere. And they are clearly nowhere near the Earth. And the striking bit for me, the thing that makes me suspect that Bart is more of a grifter than a genuine doubter, is that he commented on that video of mine. And he didn't address any of my points. He didn't attempt to explain why the clouds didn't change or how they managed to clearly take the camera to a window in plain sight and show the Earth way off in the distance. But despite not having answers to those points, he still continues to go on to podcast after podcast, parroting the same claim, whilst constantly pushing for people to go to his website and buy his books. And it's why I suspect we have the opening that we have to this podcast.
Obviously, like the last time you and I talked, we thought it would be a great idea to have you debate somebody on this. I don't know, have you ever done a debate on this with anybody?
No. To me, that would be like debating if the sky is blue. It's blue and they did fake the moon landing. I bet my life on it.
Back in April 2024, Bart was on Joe Rogan, running through much the same script as this. And at the end of that show, Joe asked if Bart would be up for going back on and having a debate against somebody.
I've never debated anybody about whether it was real or not.
Nobody ever wanted to?
No one ever asked me to debate them.
Would you be willing to debate somebody? If
Sure.
I get someone to come on here and prepare and talk to you and refute all this stuff?
Sure.
Okay.
Bart was more than up for it. I even had people reaching out asking if I would be interested in doing it. I said I would, but I doubt that Joe actually knows who I am. But Tim Dodd, who runs the Everyday Astronaut channel, which is a much bigger channel than mine, and who has done a monster video debunking the sorts of claims that Bart makes, tweeted Joe saying he would be up for doing the debate with Bart. In September, Tim, during one of his live streams, was asked if the debate was going ahead, and he said it was supposed to be, but seemingly Bart was getting cold feet.
Okay, so first off, I have heard from individuals that have spoken with him, and he's kind of seeming to get cold feet about coming back to the United States to do. He does not live in the United States. Apparently, I think he lives in Asia, and he basically made it sound like, oh, I don't know, just kind of grumbling about it. So trying, would love to debate him.
Then Tim mentioned on another live stream at the start of March that he'd been working to try and get a debate with Bart on the Lex Friedman channel, but that the date kept getting pushed back.
Your support. Tim, the Apollo video was amazing. With all the research you put into it, would you consider debating a moon? Yes, I have tried. We've actively been working with Bart Seabrel and with Lex Friedman to do a debate. And I prepared for it. I have fully prepared, and I'm ready for that. And unfortunately, it's backed out twice. We've had dates on the calendar twice.
Then Bart was on Danny Jones's podcast shortly afterwards, and Danny put the same question to Bart about would he be willing to have a debate with somebody. But by that point, Bart's changed his stance on the matter.
I'm really not interested in debating anybody. I would do it as a favor to him, and Lex Friedman asked me to do it, and I agreed to do it with him. But that, to me, is like debating if the sky is blue. The sky's blue. We don't need to debate it. Plus, these people he's putting up, or Lex would put up, they're the victims, not the perpetrators. Do you understand? Put up NASA administrator, put up a line Apollo astronaut.
He says he doesn't want to debate the victims, the people who believe NASA, only the perpetrators. Hence, we then end up with this podcast where poor Charlie Duke turns up, seemingly under the impression that he's there to share his story about going to the moon, and instead gets blindsided by Bart hurling accusations that he's a liar. Which, strangely, isn't the first time that Bart's done that. You would have thought he'd have learnt his lesson, though, after he did the same thing to Buzz Aldrin. I suspect Bart's tactic is more along the lines that he doesn't want to debate people like myself or Tim who are familiar with his script and his tactics. Bart Cybrell's tactics very much mimic the behaviour of Flat Earth Dave. Turn up on podcast after podcast, making claim after claim, but with no real evidence to support it.
People can say anything. The evidence is not overwhelming.
But only wants to speak to people who aren't already familiar with his claims so they don't know the counter-arguments that can pick him apart. And then spend most of the show plugging his stuff for people to go and buy. And whilst he says he doesn't want to debate the victims, only the perpetrators, in my eyes, anybody who watches any of those podcasts and walks away from it thinking, wow, Bart's changed my mind and I don't think we landed on the moon, those people are victims and Bart is the perpetrator. It's just a shame that a lot of these podcasts with the huge audiences are happy to give a platform to Bart to parrot his same old script of trust me bro, I know a guy, but don't seem interested in having people on who can challenge the arguments. Even if Bart's too coward to sit there and defend his claims, it would be nice for these podcasts to have people on who are knowledgeable about the moon landings to set the record straight. Channels like Everyday Astronaut, Scott Manley or Vintage Space. But I guess the controversy is what gets the views. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.